Welcome everyone to our Packers News Camp Chat virtually alongside Pete Dougherty. I am Olivia Reiner. The Packers are continuing into their acclimation period of training camp. We heard from head coach Matt LaFleur and wide receiver Devante Adams today. Before we get into that, I want to remind you a couple of different things. First of all, yesterday we had some pretty terrible hate speech in some of our comments yesterday. We were not super pleased to see that. I just want to reiterate, no hate speech will be tolerated on our live stream. We will, going forward, have someone moderate and just check in on the chat and make sure everyone is being kind to each other. If there is hate speech in our chat, that person will be banned from the page. We do not want any of that going forward. I apologize to everyone that was in our stream yesterday. And like I said, going forward, we will have someone moderating the chat. That being said, please, we do love to hear from you. We want to hear your questions and your thoughts. So if you have any, please leave them for us over on Facebook or on YouTube. We will address some of those, as always, toward the end of our conversation today. Pete, as I mentioned, the Packers are back in the facility to continue through their acclimation period of training camp. That includes some walkthroughs as well as strength and conditioning. Today, the team was actually able to have all 80 players on their roster that are healthy right now in the facility. The NFL has limited each team to 80 players in the facility at once due to coronavirus concerns. The Packers have 5 COVID-19 reserve players who are on a list that are not allowed in the facility. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have coronavirus. It means that they've either tested positive or they've come into contact with someone that is tested positive. Because the roster can really change at any moment, they have to be fluid and willing and able to adjust regardless of the situation. How are the Packers preparing for any given scenario regarding their roster?
You know, LaFleur was kind of asked that today in his teleconference, his Zoom conference. Didn't really answer that part of it. They always have a list of emergency players, guys who if someone goes down, that they'll go to who are available on the street. They always have that, all off season and during the season. But they've got to pay more attention to it now because they could lose 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 players in just the span of a couple of days with COVID, with what we've seen in baseball. They just have to keep working those lists. They must have people on other practice squads they like. Once the regular season starts, it'll probably be mostly guys who came to camp with them. So at least those guys will know the offense and would be easier to plug in if they had to sign them, or at least promote guys in the practice squad and add to their current practice squad. But they're going to be using those lists, you would think, more than they ever have in the past, because it's going to happen. Every team's going to get hit by this, at some point or other, or at many points during the season.
A big part of the game coming back, just in general, is going to be for the players to be able to stay healthy during the coronavirus pandemic. Wide receiver Devante Adams said today that he has no problem social distancing at home. Here is exactly what he had to say.
To be real with you, I have no problem with being a hermit, man. I mean, aside from the COVID and all that, like that takes it to a new level. Obviously, it makes you think 3 times rather than twice about whether or not you should go do whatever. But at the end of the day, I don't do much, man. I'm a simple man. I work out. I live and breathe wide out play, and I love my family. I got my daughter there, and with COVID and everything, obviously, I left my house maybe 10 times this off season for something unrelated to getting food. I got a beautiful house in California, so I was able to do my chipping, get my golf in at home. I got a basketball court, so not to flex on anybody, but there's not much that I needed to leave the house for.
Pete, Devante Adams not going out much in the offseason. He said he doesn't have many plans to leave the house when he's outside of the facility this upcoming season. How much of an advantage can teams have this season depending on the health of their roster?
I was over the weekend, I was talking with had a long conversation with a front office executive in the league, and we talked about a lot of different things. And one of the things he said was, I think whoever wins the Super Bowl is going to be the team that manages COVID the best, which means probably has the fewest games lost of players, or at least of key players losing them to COVID. And there's probably a lot of truth to that. So that's going to be huge. One of the things I'm curious to see is whether, because of the less activity in the off season and the slow ramp up to training camp, whether there'll be actually fewer injuries in camp and during the season than in a regular year. There was a story I was seeing about the coach at Dartmouth. They're famous for about 5 years ago. They don't ever hit in practice. They never have full contact, even on the line, in practice ever. And I think they quoted their coach as saying they won the Ivy League last year, I think, and had only one loss. And I think the quote from him was they really didn't have an injury last season. Now, there's a lot of luck involved with 0 injuries too. But anyway, I wonder what teams will learn about the health of their team in a strange off season and a strange season like this. And assuming everybody does a little less hitting, there's 14 days of padded practice, so teams are talking about doing more scrimmage type stuff, but not having preseason games too. What do they learn about keeping a team healthy and about hitting? And I mean, is this just going to keep us on this path where there's less and less hitting every year? And, maybe 10 years or 15 years from now, where everybody's, even in the NFL, is doing it like Dartmouth?
When it comes to how these training camps are structured, we'll see if the Packers or any NFL team tries to carry over some of the lessons learned now into future season. Moving on to some of the personnel decisions that the Packers are going to have to make and just things they're going to have to keep in mind going forward into training camp. Talking about the receivers, as I mentioned, heard from Devante Adams today. I asked him, I was curious, 5 of the Packers receivers in his room are going into their 2nd or 3rd seasons in the league. I asked him, when he was going into his 2nd or 3rd year, what were some of the aspects of his game that started to really click for him at the time? And he said one of the biggest changes was his connection with quarterback Aaron Rodgers and his understanding of what his role is on the team. What developments, Pete, should the Packers anticipate their younger receivers making this upcoming season?
Yeah, excuse me. That's an important question, because last year they were expecting pretty big improvement out of someone like Valdez-Scantling, and it didn't happen. It looked like it would early in camp. I remember thinking, yeah, he looks better. And by the end of the season, he was hardly playing at all. So you can't bank on it. You hope to get it. You should get it from guys that young, but you can't bank on it. St. Brown will be a guy to look for because he missed all last season. So he at least had a chance to, he was still around the team last year after getting hurt near the end of camp. But he's a guy who could take a nice jump. There's a lot of ways they can improve. I think of Adams. Adams actually he had a poor 2nd season, and the Packers were kind of concerned, maybe this was a bust as a pick. But he also, it turns out, that ankle injury he sustained during that season that contributed to him having a down year, relatively speaking. I think the ankle injury was probably a big deal. It was his 3rd season where he really took off. So, maybe Valdez-Scantling has a big 3rd season. Lazard is probably someone you can look to take a nice jump, because he's going to get a lot of reps, because he earned them with his play the second half of last season.
There aren't too many new faces in that wide receivers room going into this season. However, along the offensive line, there is one notable new face. That would be right tackle Rick Wagner, after Brian Balaga decided to take his talents elsewhere and was signed by the Chargers to a long-term deal. The Packers picked up Wagner. Matt LaFleur spoke a little bit today about how he feels comfortable with right guard Billy Turner to potentially play anywhere along the offensive line, not just right guard. Did not tip his hand exactly as to what they're thinking of who's going to be the starter at the right tackle position. Pete, how likely is it that Rick Wagner is the starter at right tackle come the start of the season?
I mean, I guess, if you're putting odds down, he's got to be the favorite. I think I have to go back and look at his contract, but I think they're paying like $6 million or so this year. I think it was somewhere around there. They signed him to be the starter over there, but it doesn't mean he will be. It wasn't like this was a huge free agent signing and a 5-year deal that averages $12 million or something like that. So if they don't like what they see, and it sounds like he had a down year for Detroit last year. If they don't like what they see, they could bump Taylor out there. They could bump Jenkins out there. Because I think Lane Taylor could play out there. He also could play guard, and as you mentioned, Billy Turner could possibly move out there. So they have options, but I think teams, generally speaking, don't like to move guys because then you're changing 2 spots instead of just 1. But I think all that stuff is going to be – that probably won't be sorted out till we're at least a week into all the padded stuff at practice. And LaFleur mentioned going into Lambeau. I think he said he thinks he might go in there 2 or 3 times to kind of have the scrimmage periods for a couple practices. And those will probably be the kind of settings where that'll weigh a lot in making decisions such as that.
They have no shortage of options along the offensive line. It's just what will those choices ultimately end up being? It's something that we'll be keeping an eye on heading into the start of on-field padded training camp. Let's move on to some of our questions over on Facebook. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will start with Rich. Rich wants to know, do the Packers or Packers fans look for big use of the H-back this year? The Packers signed H-back / tight end Josiah DeGuara in the 3rd round of this past NFL draft. Pete, he's a rookie. He's coming into this scenario where he isn't going to have had the experience of rookie camp. Plus, he's going to have an abbreviated preseason training camp, no preseason games to show at all. What do you expect out of him going into this season, and what kind of role can he play in Matt LaFleur's offense?
Yeah, I'm sure that doesn't help their plans, but you got to think, 3rd round for an H-back, that's a really high pick for that position. So they obviously really like the guy, and that suggests they're really committed to playing a fair amount of H-back, using him as – he's not a fullback like Juszczyk is for San Francisco, but it's the same. It's basically the same principle. So I would think even as a rookie, he's probably going to get a lot of playing time. It could be one of those things where it increases as the season goes on. I would think we'll see him out there a lot. I bet we'll see a lot more 2 tight end this year than we saw last season. So yeah, I think that'll be a big part of the offense. I don't know, like Juszczyk plays, I looked it up. I think it's right around 50% of the 49ers snaps. I wouldn't think as a rookie DeGuara would play that much, but wouldn't be a surprise at all to see it end up being a third of the snaps, with it being lower than that early in the year and higher than that as you get to the last month. I think that's a decent guess.
We'll see how many reps he's taking in training camp and who he's taking reps with as camp starts to progress and they get out onto the field. But it's certainly an interesting question, Rich. Thank you for asking. Let's move over to Josh. Josh asks, should the Packers re-sign running back Aaron Jones? And if so, how much should they pay him? Pete, I'll ask you to put on your Brian Gutekunst general manager hat just for this question. The Packers are heading into an interesting cap scenario in 2021 where the minimum cap is set to be about $175 million, not including any rollover that they would bring over from 2020 cap space. That being said, they have a lot of 2021 free agents, including Aaron Jones, not including, or it does include, the others would include left tackle David Bakhtiari and defensive lineman Kenny Clark, just to name a few. Pete, if you're Brian Gutekunst, at this point in the season, how likely is it that Aaron Jones is a Packer again in 2021?
Yeah, big question, and something that front offices around the league wrestle with because it's the running back position. You know, that $175 million figure for the cap next year as the lowest it could be. That's about $40 million lower than it was projected to be before all this stuff happened in the offseason. So that's a lot less. Besides the guys you mentioned, Corey Linsley's also a free agent. That's 4 good starters who are going to be free agents next offseason. It's just hard to see how they could sign all 4 of them. Maybe they can. Maybe they'll do it, and they'll, if they really want to, they can do it. But that would mean mortgaging future caps too, because you'd have to just spread some of that money out to offer a contract good enough to get those guys to bite. As we talked yesterday, I got to think Clark and Bakhtiari are by far the highest priorities. Jones is a really, really good player. I mean, he made their offense go last year, but he plays running back, and the recent history of signing running backs and paying them, it just has not worked out very well because the injury rate at that position is so high, and guys go from being good to not so good so quickly because of the punishment they take. I guess I would probably put him a little higher than Lindsley on the priority list if I'm the Packers, and if they can sign 3 of them, I'd probably go for him. But as the question, as Josh mentions, the money is big. The average I would try to come in on. Now the new money, they got the new money stuff, which can inflate what the figure is, but the real money that I'd be willing to pay him per year would probably fall in the, I don't know, 8 to 9 million area at the most, which, because of his injury history, if they offer him a decent guarantee, maybe they can get him to bite, because he knows he could get hurt too, and then there might not be much next year in free agency for him. So maybe they could get that done during the season and get him to bite at a relatively team-friendly price, because they need multiple good running backs. I think one of the reasons they drafted Dillon, besides the possibility that they could lose Jones after the season, is the numbers say, and you didn't need the numbers to see this, anybody watching could see the offense was so much better when Jones was on the field than when he wasn't. And he's a guy you gotta monitor his snaps. He played about 60%. I find it hard to believe they want to play him any more than that, because then you might not have him in January when you really need him. So you need 2 really good backs if you want that offense to operate at a high level, with how much it appears LaFleur is going to want to run and base everything off that outside zone run. So you need 2 of them. So that's in the argument for re-signing Jones, because he's a really dynamic player. Anyway, long story short, that's a great question and something to watch. And I would put Clark and Bakhtiari ahead of him on the priority list, but I would at least try, if I were the Packers, if you can get him to bite at a lower number, because of his injury history, and he knows his injury history. Maybe he'll just take the bird in the hand, and you can get him and get a couple more really good years out of him. It's risky with those running backs, but he's a really good football player too, and he helps make that offense go.
Gutekunst and his staff are going to have a very difficult decision to make heading into next season in 2021, addressing all of their free agents. They'll decide exactly what they decide to do. I'm going to take this question next from Robin. Robin poses this question to me. Pete, I will also open this question to you. What rookie or draft pick do you look forward to seeing this season? I think going into, or I suppose coming out of the draft, I think everyone was really looking forward to seeing quarterback Jordan Love. However, the window of opportunity that we're going to have to see him is going to be a lot more limited because of the lack of preseason games this offseason, which were canceled because of an NFL and NFLPA agreement due to the coronavirus. Pete, how likely is it that we're going to see Love at all going into the season?
Well, the Packers are probably hoping, you would think they're hoping not at all, right? Because that would mean Rodgers is hurt or on the COVID list. Chances are he's going to be the backup, but, maybe I'm crazy in thinking. I don't think so, but I don't think it's a given he's the number 2, especially with no off-season stuff and no preseason games. Boyle could still end up being the number 2 for this season. It wouldn't change the future plans. Obviously, Love is the future at that position, but it wouldn't be a total shock if Boyle were the number 2 this year. I mean, he's got some ability, and this is his 3rd season, so he certainly knows the NFL and the Packers offense a lot better than Love does. If that's the case, then Love wouldn't see the field unless both of those guys were out. So I don't know if COVID will hit so hard that it's a given that, all 3 quarterbacks on most teams' rosters are going to end up playing or not. Who knows on that, but it's probably pretty iffy on whether Love will see the field this year. And I'm just looking forward. I'm really curious to see how he looks on the practice field even, and see how live his arm look. It sure looks out live on tape, and how his decision making is. And And the second and third picks, Dylan and DeGuara too, are going to be important players this year. So curious to see how they look and whether DeGuara is that sneaky good H-back player who was worth picking that high, or whether he's not.
Packers are slated to get back onto the field starting next week in practice. Now they've been doing some strength and conditioning stuff on the field. However, next week we should be able to start viewing practice as it officially begins, which means you're going to want to be subscribed to PackersNews.com for all your Packers updates. We will be there at practice in this sort of interesting time that we're in because of the pandemic and the limited media access that most people will have at camp just in general this preseason training camp period of time. So make sure you're subscribed to us. Also, make sure you're following us on all of our social media platforms. We will be live for the rest of the week and going into the next several weeks of training camp. So make sure you come back over here to chat with me, and maybe we'll get to see Pete again soon too. Love to have you again, Pete. I'll have you back if that's okay.
The pleasure's all mine, Olivia.
Great. Love to hear it. All right, that's going to do it for us today, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. For Pete, I'm Olivia. We'll see you next time.